It may seem strange to consider that our job would be part of our Buddhist practice, and yet that's the way the Buddha framed it in the Eightfold Path, that practice is really part of our entire lives, including our job. So what does it mean to practice right livelihood, as it's called? In what follows, I'm going to be using as background Bhante Gunaratana's very good book, 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness. I'm not going to be following his lead exactly and entirely, but it's good background reading if you want to learn more about this and the other practices in the Eightfold Path. And Bhante G calls this skillful livelihood, which is just another way to say right livelihood. Traditionally, we follow right livelihood by avoiding the 5 types of wrong livelihood. So what are the 5 types of wrong livelihood? These are trade in weapons, in living creatures, in meat, in intoxicants, and in poisons. That is to say, 5 different kinds of trade. Now, it really was that in the early Sangha, wealthy tradespeople, wealthy traders were a very important part of the support system, the people donating money to the Sangha. That's probably the reason why, and traders as well. Trading was a very, very important job at the time, so that's probably why these 5 different sorts of wrong livelihood all involve trade. One question that may arise, however, for us is why these 5 in particular. It seems a rather strange and restricted group of wrong livelihoods. Isn't there more to it than that? And indeed, I think there is, but we have to look a little deeper beneath the surface at what the Buddha says in other places and try to give it some interpretation. In fact, elsewhere in the early suttas, the Buddha is asked about 2 different forms of livelihood, one being an actor or dancer, depending on how you interpret that. Basically, in ancient India, actors were dancing their roles, so there's sort of a mixed role there, and the other being a warrior. In both cases, the Buddha is asked about these livelihoods by people who practice them, and he seems unwilling to give an answer directly. Indeed, the person asking in both cases has to ask 3 times before the Buddha is willing to answer, and this is sort of a trope in ancient India, or certainly in early Buddhism, that if somebody doesn't want to answer and they're asked 3 times, they will give an answer even though they don't want to. And so in both cases, the Buddha says that somebody involved in these livelihoods is in danger of ending up in a hell realm, which I take to mean that these are also both forms of wrong livelihood, although they don't appear in the traditional list of 5. Now, we might wonder why that's the case. In particular, we might wonder why that's the case with the actor or dancer. The Buddha says that that's because the actor or dancer is engaged essentially in intoxicating people with tales that tend to increase their greed, perhaps their lust, perhaps their anger, and their delusions. And so for those reasons, the person involved in that kind of intoxication is basically doing a kind of a wrong thing. In the case of warriors, it's perhaps a little bit more obvious. The warrior's livelihood is essentially involved with killing other human beings, which clearly is not the sort of thing you want to be involved with if you're a Buddhist. I mean, that is to say, Buddhism, first precept is not to kill. Further, when it comes to ascetics, there are long lists of wrong livelihood that include such things as astrology and palm reading and all kinds of prophecy making and divining and a whole bunch of things, which I think implies or shows that the idea of wrong livelihood is actually, again, quite a bit larger than those traditional 5. So what's going on here then? Well, I think the case, if we look at the broad scope of wrong livelihoods in early Buddhism, the problem seems to be one of harm. That is to say, engaging in livelihoods that cause harm either directly or indirectly. Now, that's a little less clear when it comes to the role of ascetics, as we've just seen. It may be that the Buddha considered some of these livelihoods to be kind of swindles of one sort or another. It may also be that these livelihoods would essentially engage the ascetic in worldly practices of gaining money from people or gaining fame, things that essentially harmed their ascetic practices, harmed their vows of a certain kind, that they would have taken vows to be non-worldly, and here they are engaging in worldly sorts of endeavors. It may also be that these kinds of practices, when undertaken by ascetics, would have harmed their standing in the broader community by making people aware that they weren't upholding their ascetic vows in certain ways, or making money, or other sorts of things. It's also true that much of those long lists I was talking about that involve ascetics of wrong livelihood, there are differences between the different recensions, between the Pali and the Chinese and Tibetan and so on. And so it's not entirely clear how much of this goes back to the earliest Sangha, how much of it may have been added to over the centuries, basically, as monastics in different communities found one another to be doing things that they thought were bad, and so they sort of inserted them into the texts through time. Again, hard to say exactly. In the case of lay people, wrong livelihoods for lay people, the cases are a bit clearer. If we're talking about trade in weapons or poisons or living beings, pretty clear, or being a warrior for that matter, it's pretty clear we're talking about direct harm. Trade in living beings at that time would have meant, among other things, being involved in the slave trade and so on, because there was slavery at the time. Those would have involved pretty clearly direct harm of one kind or another. With the cases of being an actor or dancer, or perhaps the cases of meat, perhaps, depending on how we think of that, or intoxicants, those might be more cases of indirect harm, that there's harm involved somewhere along the line if we're doing that sort of thing. The problem here that I see is that the concept of indirect harm is a very fuzzy concept, it's a very fuzzy idea. I mean, virtually anything that we do in our lives is going to involve ourselves in some indirect harm somewhere. Indeed, it certainly seems to me that being an actor or a dancer is much less harmful than virtually any job that people normally do in daily lives. It seems relatively benign. So if that is bad enough to say, look, that might be the sort of thing the Buddha wouldn't have liked, then it's pretty clear that there's a lot of things that involve us in indirect harm. So at the end of the day, we've got to be judicious in how we apply these kinds of rules or suggestions. The early texts, which is what I've really been dealing with in this video, the early texts only give us so much, and what we have to do in our practice is to interpret them in our own lives. Does our job involve us harming others, either directly or perhaps indirectly through swindles or lies of some kind? Or is our jobs toxic to ourselves? Now, there are ways that we can practice with all of this. I mean, for example, if we're having trouble with a coworker, we can practice something like loving kindness. There are a number of what are known as the Brahma Viharas, practices of loving kindness, compassion, that we can do, that we can help perhaps reduce our tendency towards anger towards others, maybe towards our coworkers. But there's a limit to, I think, how much we should be expected to endure. That is, being kind and compassionate, avoiding harm, is just as true for ourselves as it is for the public. If our job is harming us, then there's a certain amount we might want to try to do. Perhaps we can try to fix it. Perhaps we can talk to somebody within the organization. But most likely we're not going to get very far, or at least in many circumstances we aren't. And then we have to make a wise decision about whether the job is right for us, or whether we should perhaps consider changing jobs, quitting and moving somewhere else. Now, in his book, Bhante Gunaratana talks about this issue and says basically that, clearly we should take time and be very careful about a decision to change jobs. It's not the sort of thing we should just do willy-nilly. But he also says that those who protect the Dharma are protected by the Dharma. That is to say, we should have this kind of confidence that having done this, we will have good, beneficial results on the other side. Now, perhaps this is an example of karma in his estimation, or at least perhaps an idea that by behaving in an upright fashion, a fashion where we are supporting an ethics of non-harming, that it will impress other people and perhaps impress a future employer, and perhaps if we find the right place, they will hire us because of that kind of upright posture that we have. It also may simply be an example of sort of magical thinking, that that if we behave well, that the world will be obliged to be good to us. That's not necessarily the case in my estimation. I'm a bit more hard-nosed about these things. I mean, karma, in a sense, is broadly applicable. I mean, usually if we're good people, good things will happen. But I don't think that we can necessarily be 100% confident of that fact. And indeed, we all know of examples that contradict that kind, these kinds of Pollyanna-ish ideas about the world. That is to say, I think many of us will have to come to understand that there may not be a good alternative for us in our jobs at the present moment. And also there's, again, plenty of room for disagreement, dispute, and different interpretations about what makes right livelihood and wrong livelihood. I mean, to return to the example from before, if it really is that being an actor or dancer is wrong livelihood, then a lot of things are wrong livelihood. It's not really clear how we can support ourselves in virtually anything that we do. I mean, just to take some examples here. Being a person who delivers food. Well, we are doing a great service to people in delivering food to them. However, we're going to have to pollute the environment in order to do so, and virtually any understanding of that. It's going to take trucks or cars, it's going to take vehicles to transport that food. Even if they're electric, that still involves us in a lot of pollution along the way. If we're making cars, if we're in an industry that makes cars, again, we're going to have to make a lot of pollution. But on the other hand, we're helping people by producing cars that people can use to deliver food to one another, for example. This goes to show that I think arguably all jobs that we do, any job that we do, is going to involve some trade-offs between benefit and harm. Some things that we're doing in virtually any legitimate job is going to be creating benefit for somebody. That's why people buy the service or the object. But it also involves some harm along the way. That is to say, any job, virtually any job that I can think of, any job I can think of, involves what we might call dark and light karma. It's not all light karma. In one early sutta, the Buddha talks about different kinds of karma, and one of these is dark and light karma. That is to say that some things we involve ourselves with, indeed, as I've just said, virtually any job we involve ourselves with involves some aspects that are beneficial, other aspects that are harmful, and it's up to us to decide what kind of balance is good enough for us. So some of you might say, well, just become a monastic then. And indeed, that's what the Buddha would have suggested, is that if you're really concerned about these kinds of things, then joining a sort of a monastic order and giving up the making of wealth takes us out of that whole system of dark and light karma and puts us in a position where we are professional people along the path, professional practitioners. On the other hand, I think we have to keep in mind that the preservation of the Sangha in which monastics can live depends essentially on the existence of a broader, wealthy lay community that's willing to and able to donate money, food, wealth, clothing, shelter, medicine to the Sangha in order to sustain it. That is to say that the Sangha, just as much as the lay people, are indirectly involved in the same kinds of dark and light karma that everybody is. There's really no directly escaping this if we're talking about literal complete purity in that sense. That is to say, the Sangha is indirectly benefiting from lay livelihoods. And so what the upshot here is, I think, is that we all have to work with this ourselves and decide the best way in our livelihood to reduce the sort of harm that's occurring. If there's harm to the larger community, harm to the people buying our products or to the environment, Perhaps we can work within the company to try to minimize that insofar as we can. We may not be very successful unless we're in a position of some power and control, but at least we can do our best. If the damage is to ourselves, then once again we can consider ways of either practicing with that by doing some practices such as loving kindness, by talking to our superiors, or by quitting. We can move elsewhere if our job just doesn't seem right to us. In my next video, I'll be discussing right effort, which is the next stage along the Eightfold Path, and a stage that is absolutely critical to the practice of the entire path. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.